Welcome, travelers, to my realm of nightmares. Allow me to be your personal assistant. Come in, take a seat, get comfortable. For when you step into my realm, there's no stepping out.
He came from another time. That much was clear. Something about him looked strange, unfamiliar to us, yet we could tell that he was almost human. His structure was similar to ours. He had the same limbs, the same overall stature, but he was different in ways that are hard to describe. I suppose I should explain a few things about this situation. I'm the lead doctor of this facility. We've been investigating a signal that we've been receiving for the past few months. We ended up in the middle of the Arctic. The middle of nowhere, really. You may be asking what the signal was, and that I cannot really answer. It was some kind of ping, a shrill sound that would sound like it was growing in intensity, then slowly fade out. Not dissimilar to how it sounds as a car passes by, quiet, loud, and back to silent. We had spent months trying to decipher the signal. It was unlike anything we had ever heard, but we knew it was important. None of the experts the world over could tell us what it meant, but we had all agreed that it was a beacon of sorts. We tracked it day in and day out, eventually leading us to the Arctic, as previously stated. We found the exact location from which the signal was being produced, but there was nothing there. It was then that the realization hit. We needed to dig. It took a painful number of man-hours and machines, but after digging down much further than ever anticipated, we found the source of the signal. It was a coffin, adorned in gold and the most precious of jewels. Upon the coffin was a number of inscriptions that we couldn't decipher. Among the illegible text, there was one small entry that we could actually read.
May malice of greed be the folly of Adam, and this cask hold him steady. If any man is to follow in the steps of Adam, then surely the serpent will take what is his.
Obviously, this piqued our desire to know more. We excavated the container and took it back to our makeshift Arctic laboratory. We thawed it to the best of our ability and chipped the remaining ice away. We had discussed whether or not we should continue, but in the end, curiosity had won us all over. We broke the strange wax seal over the lid and cautiously removed the lid. It was then that the true source of the signal was revealed. A man-like creature lay in the container, holding himself in a fetal position. We were all taken aback by the possibility of the signal coming from an organic life form and not a machine. How could anything living possibly emit a radio signal? We all stared at the being, thinking about the possibilities as he slowly opened his eyes, as the life lifted back into his body, as he began stretching his limbs and unfolding his wings. It was clear that this being was not Adam. No, this was the serpent. Honestly, it didn't take long. I remember a time when we all thought it was so far off that nothing like this could happen in our fragile lifetimes. Looking back, it's almost laughable. I've been spending my last few days watching videos of how things were. I found a box of DVD with permanent marker written on them. I have no idea who the people in the videos are, but they were filled with recordings of celebrations. Birthday, Christmas, New Year's. There was even one in the pile labeled Family Reunion. It's a bit strange to see that someone out there still put videos on DVDs. Such an old way of doing things. But if nothing else, I'm grateful. It's been a positive escape from existence. Of course, the nostalgia had been putting some strange thoughts in my head. How did we end up where we are? How did I get forced into this situation? Sure, these thoughts are fruitless. but I've never been one for fruit, so I decided to entertain them. I feel like most people would say that we're apathetic, and that's what brought us here. At least, that's what they would say if they weren't mostly dead, and maybe they'd be right. It's not hard to get wrapped up in your own life, uncaring of how everyone else is living. Why should I care if my neighbor 2 doors down the way had a bad day and decided to drunkenly take it out on his wife? Not really my problem. Someone probably also pushed that it was caused by politics, the never-ending squabbling between opposite ends of the same spectrum. More like two different sides of the same coin, but I don't think it would have made a difference. Sure, the people voted for their leaders, others voted for who they wanted. Sitting here today, doesn't really feel like the end of everything was partisan. Death is indiscriminate. Doesn't care who you voted for. It doesn't care what you considered right or wrong. Ironically, so are bombs, missiles, bullets. They just kind of do their own thing. Now, if you were to ask me, I think it was ignorance. We did all we could to steer the country, the world, in the right direction. We were charitable to some extent. There was even a brief moment when everything was set into motion, where we loved our fellow man. Again, laughable. The sirens wailed, the skies lit up, the cities burned, and we waited to help each other. By then, it was too late. Everything had been set into motion. The steps chosen to start anew were already being followed, and with those 3 simple words, we would all meet our end. With those 3 simple words, we would get what we deserved. Our penance for our apathy, our fighting, the wars, the murder, everything our species had ever done. It was then that we were baptized by fire. I adore my little songbird, my cheerful, little, insignificant, feather-covered friend that has made it a point to perch just outside my window every single morning as the sun lifted its way over the horizon. I appreciate your shrill song more than anything, your metallic chirps, and your slightly off-tune whistle that managed to find the path into my heart and pry open the iced-over doorways into my soul. Somehow, you managed to make me feel something that I once thought I would never feel again. Happiness. The first morning I saw you, I was hesitant to actually see you for what you were. My medicated mind made me want to see nothing more than a crimson blur on the concrete that was the ledge outside of my room. I call it my room, but it was more like a cell, a prison that was built to house me until I die. A pathetic collection of 4 walls that was identical to every other in the building. Rooms meant to house people like me, people that were determined to be a threat to themselves or others. I was told that something in me was broken. I was told that I was likely to break and hurt someone. I was told I was a burden to society. But that morning, when my eyes focused on the pale orange and pink color of the sunrise as they contrasted the colorless concrete, you were the little silhouette I, at first, failed to comprehend. My eyes struggled to actually focus on you, but as they did, I saw that beauty with which my life would be graced. You stood there, your crest held high, as to signal how confident you were in your own existence. Your crimson feathers, the black circles around your eyes, almost like a bandit's mask, all of that managed to steal my focus from the morning sky. That morning was the first time that a smile had managed to creep its way across my face for as far back as I could remember. You were a shining beacon in the shadows that encompassed my life, my mind. The darkness that had become the foundation of my world felt like it had been suddenly fractured, a seam shown to me and a loose thread highlighted. With your small orange beak, you gripped that thread and you pulled it as hard as your tiny frame would allow. I stared at you for as long as you sat there. I watched you stretch your wings. I watched you preen some of your feathers, take in the warmth of the sunlight, and I watched as you flew down to the ground, grabbed some sort of berry from the bush by the wall, and made your way back to enjoy the bounty of your hunt, you tore into that berry, satisfaction taking you over. It was then that my course of action became clear. I had to keep you coming back. I had to figure out what I could do to keep you happy. If I had to be honest, I only knew one thing about you and your kind. You liked seeds and berries. I started talking to one of the orderlies that I had become friends with, and I practically begged her to add blueberries to the lunch menu. It was a strange request on my part, but not something that would really concern her. In the end, she relented, and when lunch came around, I was able to get my hands on just a few for you specifically. When I got back to my room, I opened my window slightly, and I pushed the corner of the screen, separating it from the exterior frame. While the bars over the windows were able to keep me in, I could at least create this little doorway between our worlds. I placed the berries on the windowsill, and I sat there waiting. I sat on my bed, watching the windowsill for the entire night, knowing that you'd be there to find them first thing in the morning, and I refused to miss it. Sure enough, as the sun started to peek its head over the horizon, as the sky started to glow its hazy pink and orange hues, your bright red feathers graced my existence, and you landed on the concrete. I could feel my heart starting to race. You were truly a stimulant to my colorless life, a scarlet beacon of hope in the umbra that had overcome me. Watching your small beak grab those berries, tear open the outer skin, and rip into the flesh as the light spread over you. How could I possibly explain it? It was truly pure bliss. I was feeling honest happiness for the first time since I had been wrongfully pushed through the doors of this facility. They claimed me mad, yet does a madman find happiness in nature? Would a madman find it in his soul to assist a creature smaller than he in finding sustenance? If yes, then truly I may have been mad, but a madman seldom find a smile on their face as they observe the beauty of our natural world. It was at this point I chose to remove the chains that society had placed upon me. I stopped listening during group meetings, and I chose to use you as my therapy. You would be what guided me from here on. I made it a point to greet you with your morning berries for several days after this. I slept very little during these first few days, simply because I wanted to make sure that you would come back, and I wanted to make sure that you were the one to get them. I imagined that you had a nest somewhere nearby. You probably had a newly hatched offspring that you were taking bits of the meal to, and you were making sure that your female counterpart was happily fed. This was nearly confirmed to me. A morning, somewhere around 2 weeks since our little ritual had started, you arrived right on time, but you weren't alone. You swooped in and landed. Then, within a moment, another took flight from a nearby tree and landed right next to you. Her feathers lacked most of the color yours contained, but they were cherry-tipped, a beautiful gray, and faded into a delightful red. That morning was a sign from the universe that I needed you to be happy. You and your new companion, you were all I needed during this time of my life. Not this institute, not their heartless words of encouragement, and sure as hell not their god-forsaken medication. It was then that this place and their methods ceased to exist for me. I found ways around their schedules of forcing me to take their pills. I started to write a short story about a bird. I explained to my orderly friend that I found therapy in words. She was surprisingly encouraging, so much so that she and her manager came to my room to read what I had written and had decided that I should spend more time working on my newfound art than in group sessions. I agreed. Before they left my room that day, I made a single, potentially strange request to them. I told them that over the past few days, I had been craving a simple pleasure from my time before being here, sunflower seeds. I asked them if there was any way I could get unsalted sunflower seeds regularly, as I used to thoroughly enjoy them. I remember the head orderly gave me a slight look of concern, then glanced back down at my writing project. I believe that he may have had a strange feeling of success in his mind. Maybe he thought I was getting better, and that they were the ones that were causing it. He made me a deal. So long as I kept writing and could show that I was making progress, he'd bring me a bag of sunflower seeds per week. He made it very clear that if I faltered, the deal would be off. I promised him that I had no intentions to quit writing, and with that, I could now give you something to enjoy, and I would no longer have to risk getting caught with berries in my pocket. Over the next week, I felt lighter. I felt like my head was clearing out an overcast that had been there for as long as I could remember. You were the cause of my happiness. You were the reason my heart was able to feel again, and you were what I needed in my life. I had stopped sleeping entirely during this week. The medication was fully out of my system. I had practically stopped eating and was no longer speaking to anyone. I now had assurance that you and your mate would always come back to my window, and I could not be happier. That is, until this morning. Something about this morning felt strange. I hadn't fallen asleep. I knew that for a fact. But for some reason, I felt like my mind had fallen into a type of self-preservation. I watched the clock near my bed, but there was a point where I'm fairly certain it stopped counting the time. For some reason, I could no longer read the numbers that it displayed. I would not be deterred by this malfunctioning device. I turned back towards the window and waited for the sun to continue rising, except it didn't. On this morning, the sky seemed desperately overcast, and a light fog lifted off the dew-covered leaves. No matter, I knew that even if the sun was slow to rise, you would still show up right on time. I pulled open my window, pushed the screen from the corner, and displayed a pile of the seeds that I had been given, a buffet of sorts for you and your friend that I knew you could not resist. I sat and waited for you to fly down through the haze and land so valiantly as you greeted me. I waited solely for you to once again grace me with your beauty. But what showed up on my windowsill that morning was not you. That creature that landed looked like you solely in the fact that it contained red feathers upon its wings and held your same black eyes. From the haze fell this abomination that stood at least 5 times your size, with wings that surely fell into double digits and seemed to be placed at random. It held your black eyes, sure, but more than you two, it seemed to be able to see in every direction at once. Its talons, here bent in ways that would have been painful to any other creature. Its tail contained multiple layers of feather, and its beak, oh God, its beak! No longer did it have the small, orange mouth that you would so delicately pick at your food with. No, this creature's mouth was nothing more than a hole filled with sharp fragments of what I could only assume were teeth. This disgusting creature that now filled my vision landed and stared at me, making patterns of shrill metallic clicks that caused my brain to feel agony. Every single piece of its song as it whistled was enough to drive me to madness and cause my blood to run ice cold. My spine felt weak, my hands were clammy, and my face was covered in a fear-induced sweat. All of this was compounded when a second of this hideous monster landed beside the original. Her feathers, the same cherry-tipped gray as my songbird's female companion. She made the same shrill screeches as the first. I felt like I wanted to vomit. These two things, I have no idea what to truly call them. Both stood and stared at me with hunger in their eyes. What feels worse, I know now that these two beasts are here to stay. It's been what I can only imagine to be a few hours, and they haven't left. I can see by the look in their eyes that they are hungry and are willing to do anything they can to get their next meal. As the tooth-lined void on their face fills with drool, what's worse, they seem to show no interest in the sunflower seeds I so delicately placed on the windowsill. It's been 6 days. 6 long and agonizing days. And that horrible screaming has not stopped, slowed, or silenced. I have tried to ignore it. I've tried to move on with my life and move forward with things I need to do. But it seems like the screaming just keeps going and going, no matter the time of day. It is, for lack of a better word, unending. Let me step back and explain a few things. Maybe that would be for the best. I live in an apartment complex, floor 3, apartment J. I lived here for most of my adult life, and I've managed to keep to myself and enjoy my life of solitude and independence. I prefer it that way. I prefer not having to deal with other people, mostly because the more people you add to an equation, the more likely it is to become problematic. I've seen my neighbors a few times, and I say hi to them. When they pass me in the halls, sure. But honestly, I just want to enjoy my time at home, alone, sitting in my living room watching TV and eating whatever frozen foods I have on hand. It's a simple life, one that most people would shun, but it works for me. Besides, why should I care about my neighbors? They likely won't live here very long. Most people leave after their initial 2-year lease is up. A lot of people seem to think that the property manager doesn't do enough around here, or that they think they aren't kind, or whatever BS people nowadays want to throw out about their landlords. I look at it this way. I pay my rent on time, and they leave me the hell alone. I'm handy enough to fix most of my own problems, and they know it, so it's a win-win. Like I said, I've been here for around 25 years, and I've dealt with a lot of people that I personally don't care about. But as of late, things have been getting out of hand. 6 days ago, at exactly 3 in the morning, the screaming started. Now, I don't mean screaming like arguing. I mean guttural screeching. Deep, throat level, agonizing screaming. The kind of screaming that comes from someone bending your arm the wrong way until your shoulder joint snaps out of its socket. That kind of screaming. I know the exact time it started because that's when it woke me up. I was sound asleep when I heard it clear as day. I, of course, jumped out of bed and banged on the wall of the adjoining apartment in an attempt to get them to realize that they were being loud. Of course, it did absolutely nothing. They just kept screaming. I decided I would go over in the morning and give them a piece of my mind, and that I would try to go back to sleep. I might have dozed off once or twice for a few minutes, but nothing substantial. Every time I woke up, the screaming would still be there. The final time I woke up and decided to stay awake for the day, sometime around 6:30, I thought I heard another scream join into the fray. After about an hour, that thought turned to certainty. There were then 2 people screaming as loud as they could. 2 people doing everything in their power to destroy the peace and quiet that I was used to. At this point, I'd had enough. I was certain that the screaming, well, the initial screaming, was coming from apartment I, the one directly to the left of mine. I put on enough clothing to protect myself from indecent exposure, threw on my slippers, and grabbed the doorknob to angrily yank the door open. Except, the door didn't move. I twisted the knob. I watched the mechanism slip out of what was holding it. But, no matter how hard I pulled on the door, it was steadfast. I double-checked the deadbolt. It was unlocked. I slowly turned the handle, and again verified that the little metal thing was retracting. But still, no movement. I could see the light seeping into my apartment through the door frame. So it wasn't like someone built a wall around my door when I wasn't paying attention, or something. I thought that maybe something was wrong with the frame. Maybe the wood had swelled with the weather. Maybe the foundation was starting to give out and my door was bearing the brunt of the pressure. I figured that giving the door a good hard slam with my weight could break it loose. So, That's what I did. I rammed it with my shoulder, and nothing. The door refused to budge. My slamming into it, kicking it, pounding it, none of it did a damn thing to the integrity of that door. Exhausted and in a bit of pain from repeatedly colliding with the door, I relented. It wasn't moving, and there was nothing that I could do to fix that. I leaned against the door and tried to catch my breath. I decided that then would be a good time to look through the peephole to see if maybe something had happened in the hallway. I moved in and stared out into the hall of my building and was confused. There was no door across the hallway. There was no door where apartment L should be. The marking was still there to show where the apartment should be, but there was no door at all. It was as if they had removed the door and filled in the spot with the drywall, then painted it. Obviously, this wouldn't have been possible. I would have heard them doing so and noticed the maintenance people working on it. Plus, why would they shut off an entire apartment like that? The more I thought about it, the less it made sense. So, in the end, I had to stop thinking about it. I stepped away and threw myself in my recliner and just stared out into the foggy morning. I could see the street from my apartment, but it appeared to be barren. There were no cars or people out walking. It was the emptiest I had ever seen it personally. I couldn't make out the faces of the other buildings through the fog, but I could at least see the silhouettes. Not that it mattered if I couldn't leave my apartment. I sat there, just staring out at the fog as it rolled in and kept going. Then, the fact that I have a cell phone clicked in my mind. I got up, went back to my bedroom to grab my phone. It wasn't until I attempted to turn on the screen that something occurred to me. None of the lights were on anywhere in my apartment. The fact that my phone wasn't functioning, no matter what I did, verified this for me. I had no power. My apartment had plenty of windows, so it was well lit by the morning light. But none of the lights were working. None of the outlets had power. It was as if someone had flipped the breakers to the apartment, and maybe they had. The problem with that is that the breakers are in the utility closet that you could only access from the hallway, and I was stuck in my apartment. At first I was annoyed, angry, determined to scream at someone for playing this annoying trick on me. I was further enraged by that damn screaming that was coming from my neighbor's place, and now 3 other people that had joined him in this ear-piercing song. I returned to my chair and watched the day pass. My mind was almost as foggy as the clearing outside my window. I had no idea how I was going to get out of this situation other than wait for someone to rescue me. Surely someone had to be working on the solution to this problem somewhere. There's no way the police weren't already looking into the people screaming. There's no way that my neighbors, at least the ones that weren't screaming and weren't the poor souls potentially trapped in apartment L, hadn't already made a phone call to someone out there to look into the noise. My next door neighbor was the first to start screaming, so when they investigate the situation, they are bound to come up the stairs. When I heard them, I would just bang on my door for their attention and explain what's going on. Surely that would work out for me. That's what I honestly thought for the first 2 days. For nearly 48 hours, I sat in my recliner and watched the days pass by, the fog never lifting or clearing, and the entire time I watched, I didn't see a single person walking by, not a single car driving down the road. Nothing. All I saw was light that was filtered by the dense fog. Then the darkness of night. As strange as it was, I wasn't hungry at all. I'm the type that eats in a panic, so I figured I would want food, but with no power, I couldn't heat anything up. I think I ate some bread and peanut butter on day 2, but I don't recall. It wasn't until day 4 that I started thinking that maybe, just maybe, things weren't going to change. By this point, I could no longer differentiate the sound of the screams. I have no idea how many people were screaming, who they were, where they were. All I knew was that the screaming was loud, unbearable, and closing my eyes would only seem to make it louder. Like it was coming from my room, or like it was seeping into my skull and echoing through my ears. So, with that, sleep wasn't an option, no matter how much I needed it. Lack of sleep can do crazy things to your head. You start to have weird thoughts. You start to see things out of the corner of your eyes. You start to hear strange noises. Not to say that the screaming wasn't weird in and of itself. At first, I started to wonder if there was something keeping me in my apartment. Maybe like a wall. The more I stared at the spot where my neighbor's door used to be, I started to wonder if maybe they had done the same thing to my door. Maybe they had managed to put up a wall without me noticing. But how would you explain my ability to see into the halls? Simple. They left the peephole uncovered to taunt me, to let me see what was out there, to see what they had done to the others, to torture me. That had to be what was happening. It had to be. The problem with this became, what the hell do you do if you're faced with this situation? Clearly, the material they used for the exterior was of superior quality. I couldn't get my door to move at all. Then, on day 5, the plan hatched. I had 2 options to attempt the escape. The first one was the easiest of the 2, so I decided it would be plan B. That is, to break the window and attempt to climb down the building. The problem with that was that I was on the 3rd floor, and it was certain to hurt if I messed up and fell. Thus, I moved on with plan A, which was to break through the inner wall and into my neighbor's apartment. If nothing else, if this was some sort of sick prank, I'd get to damage his walls and yell at him when I got through. Step 1, find a hammer, which was already going to be an issue. I don't have a hammer in my apartment. All of my tools were in my truck, which was downstairs in the parking garage. I started digging through drawers, cabinets, and everything I had for storage to find something heavy enough to break through the wall. The closest thing I had was a meat tenderizer and a kitchen knife. And while that may not sound like it would be effective, it would be enough. If I could damage the drywall with a tenderizer, maybe I could cut through the drywall with a knife. I went to my bedroom and started on my plan. I smacked the wall as hard as I could. I put all the strength I could muster into each and every swing, only to be met with 0 in the ways it results. No matter how much I hit the wall, how much damage I should have been causing, nothing was happening. I threw the small hammer off to the side and started trying to drive the knife into the wall, trying to cut it, scratch it, or do anything that I could to damage it. But again, nothing happened, no matter what I did. I couldn't damage the wall. I tried this process on every wall of my apartment, and the results never changed. The walls were seemingly impervious to damage. I shook this off. I moved forward with plan B, breaking the window. At this point, I didn't care if I broke my arm or whatever. I would jump out if I had to. I returned to my living room and to the large bay window that loomed over my street. I took the meat tenderizing hammer and I started beating on the window. No matter how many times I hit it, no matter how much it should have been shattering, it didn't. I grabbed my lamp and threw it at the window. The glass lamp shattered. The window didn't. I tried everything I could through the night to break through any point of my apartment, but my efforts were all in vain. The thought of never escaping this hell was finally taking me over. I was stuck. There was nothing I could do to get out, and this is where I was going to die. I sat in my recliner again, just staring at the night as it started to give way to the morning. The fog that had seemingly haunted the grounds for the last few days was even more dense than it had been. I couldn't make out the silhouettes of the buildings anymore. I couldn't see the road. All I could see was a thick layer of haze, of white clouds that were engulfing everything in my vision. As I sat there and watched the night shift to morning, only by the fact that it was slightly brighter outside, I started to see something. At first, I wasn't sure what it was, and I thought maybe these past 6 days have been enough to drive me to the edge. But it started to become more clear the harder I looked. I stood up and walked over the window, stepping over pieces of the lamp and other detritus, and stopping with my face against the glass. I kept my eyes on the fog, but slowly, very slowly, an outline of a pair of eyes started to come into focus. Based on their location in the fog, whatever it was that these glowing red eyes belonged to was large, nearly the size of the neighboring buildings. I kept my focus on them. They started to glow brighter as they stared back at me. Then I noticed it wasn't just one pair of eyes that were watching me in the fog. No, it was dozens. The outline of each eye slowly took shape. I could see the dark red glow from each one, and I could feel that they were staring at me, despite their size, despite there being so many of them. I knew they were staring straight at me. They were watching me, and they were focused solely on me. As the seconds ticked away, the fog felt like it was starting to dissolve. At least enough for me to see what creature it was that I was having a staring contest with. And as my eyes pulled in the scene in front of me, as my brain slowly painted the visual and imprinted it upon my memory, the only thing I could think to do was scream. Rain can be such a calming and relaxing thing for so many people. That subtle and comforting sound as tiny droplets fall from the heavens to end up colliding with the ground. That slight pattering noise that isn't too dissimilar to a light popping. The fact that it manages to be both rhythmic and random at the same time is what I think makes it. That, along with the comforting darkness that envelops your world as the clouds roll in overhead and block out the sun. One of the most relaxing things you can probably do during an aggressive storm is turn a chair to face outside, kick back with a book and a cup of coffee, and watch as the world outside has its thirst quenched. It always works to put me into a deep, focused state, which quickly turns into me wanting to take a long, cozy nap. My favorite thing about spring is how, When a rolling storm engulfs an area, everyone and everything seems to pause and take note, almost like everything, living or not, knows to give respect to this absolute force of nature and the beauty it contains. We all fall in line with its beat and adjust ourselves accordingly. Obviously, as beautiful as storms are, they do bring some things that some could see as negative: flooding, damaging winds, hail, and in some places, things like hurricanes or tornadoes. Even a nice rain like the one we've been getting comes with the scary parts. Just the other day, the police found someone that had drowned in water that had collected in their yard. There wasn't much in the way of detail, but apparently they had managed to slip and knock themselves unconscious. Then they landed with their face in the puddle. It's a shame, but I can't imagine it was more than a crazy coincidence. Now, my biggest issue with the current storm is that it seems like it's unending. Like I said, I love the rain, but I can only take so much of it. 1 or 2 days of steady downpour is fine, but this has been going on for at least 6 days now. At some point last week, the sky opened up and it started coming down. And while it was nice for a bit, this is beginning to feel a bit excessive. And it hasn't come without its problems. There is a steady stream of water that was running from my gutter into the yard. But apparently, there's a clog somewhere because water was actually dripping in my patio door. On top of that, the collection of water on the side of the house caused a bit of flooding issues in the basement. We got it solved, thankfully, but it was still a bit of an annoyance to have to do the work in the rain. I know I'm not the only one that's been having problems, though. I read on one of my neighborhood groups that there was a house down the way that had some pretty serious damage. Apparently, one of the windows was broken because of the storm, and they had a lot of damage. On top of that, some kid has taken advantage of the broken window and trashed the place. Thankfully, the owners seem to be out of town, as no one's seen them for a few days. But they're going to be surprised when they get back home. Plus, my lethargy has absolutely had a grip on me since the storm started. I haven't been wanting to get out of bed or do any of my work projects. That droning sound that I described a moment ago is really, really good at putting my ass out for the day. I just want to lay on the couch and watch the news. Well, I would if they would stop reporting the negative stuff. I don't want to hear about murders or anything like that. I want to hear about the community coming together and fixing things. It's really sad how much the media wants to put focus on the negative and not on the positive parts of the world. Maybe that's why so many people have issues with seasonal depression and whatnot. One thing I wish they would report on is all the noise in this city. Yesterday morning, I swear, I heard some prankster screaming out his window as loud as he could. At first, I wasn't sure if I actually heard it. It happened while I was watching some dumb talk show, just after I had woken up. I was listening to them make jokes at the expense of some celebrity. I grabbed my coffee and went to take a sip, and I heard the faint sound of someone shouting. Again, I wasn't sure that it was actually a scream at first, but then they did it again, and I know for sure that's what it was. I got up to look out the window, and I saw that someone else in the neighborhood had put on their poncho and mask and started down the way to have a stern talk with a person. Good on them for being considerate and wearing their mask. But I don't think their statement got through to the person because no more than an hour later, I heard him again. Then, another an hour later. I've been getting incredibly frustrated by this whole thing because he keeps going. almost every single hour. On the hour, he keeps shouting out his window for a few minutes. Then it gets quiet again, and I get to enjoy the rain. Of course, it doesn't last long, because an hour after that, he does it again. What's worse, he's got a few of his friends to do it too. And now, there's screaming coming from other houses that are closer to me. Well, the first time, I was a bit unnerved, but when he did it again, I realized that it had to be the same dumb kid, most likely doing something stupid like this for internet clout. Now, I understand that kids will be kids, and sure, his screams aren't really hurting anyone yet, but I don't think they understand how the whole crying wolf thing works. If they keep it up, people will become desensitized to the whole thing and won't know when something serious is going on. How can they be so inconsiderate? How can people sit in their homes and think that it would be funny to disrupt the lives of others like that? Like I said, I was annoyed when they started doing it, but now they've been doing it at night, and it's starting to keep me awake. I get grumpy when I don't get enough sleep, and that, on top of how lethargic I've been from the rainstorm, is making things really difficult for me. This evening, I was watching the nightly news and waiting for the weather to come on so they could tell us how much more rain we could expect. I started to doze off, and my mind started to make up fake news stories about cults and torture. It was the craziest waking dream I have ever had. And the absurdity of it all. I heard another scream. Much like I said before, I got angry and was going to ignore it, but then I heard it again and realized that it wasn't one of the pranksters. It was coming from my neighbor's house. This situation is exactly what I was referring to when I was talking about the whole crying wolf thing. You do something stupid, like scream out your window, and make people think that something is wrong when it isn't. Then, when something is wrong, they don't realize it's actually something that's a problem. I heard this scream again and decided that I should go ahead and call the police. Something was clearly going on and he likely needed help. I grabbed my cell phone, shut off the TV, and called 911. At first, the call didn't seem to go through, but then the operator answered. I explained to them what was going on, telling them that there was a prankster down the road that they needed to deal with later, but that they needed to come out our way now to see if my neighbor is okay. The call felt a bit strange. The man asked me for my name and address and a few other questions, like if I was home alone and if I had a weapon. I didn't feel that these were normal questions, but at the same time, in today's day and age, maybe they are really adamant about protecting their officers. I guess they're going to be next door, and they wanted to make sure that I wasn't trying to lure them into a trap or something. Hard to say, really, but I gave him the information, and he hung up, saying that they would be right over for the welfare check. No more than a few minutes later, I heard a knock on the door. I was confused at first. I hadn't seen any cop cars, hadn't heard any sirens or anything. I asked who it was, just to be safe, and I felt a lot more comfortable when the man said, "It's the police. If you have a few moments, we would like to have a quick talk with you about the screaming." I glanced through the small peephole on the door just to make sure, and actually felt better when I realized it was one of my neighbors. I didn't know he was a cop, but I recognized the poncho and mask from the other day. Hopefully, he can get to the bottom of this. I'm confident he can. So, I'm going to slip on my shoes and my jacket and talk with him. I'm sure everything will be alright, and that he'll be able to help me with my issues. Then maybe I can finally get back to sleep. Well, here we go. We stood on our roof and stared out over the horizon as the sun set. The bright yellow was shredded by a gorgeous maroon that slowly faded its way into a dim purple. I pulled up my camera and took a picture of the scene in front of us. The picture struggled to capture the absolute beauty of the whole event. Maybe actually living it was what made it so breathtaking. We sat there and just watched as the sky slowly darkened, as pinhole lights slowly took over into the darkness, and the golden shades of the day finally faded into nothingness. There is something magical in being part of this moment. You see, this sunset, it was different. It had been deemed the final solar event of the entire hemisphere, which is just a fancy way of saying that it was the last sunset we would ever see. Now, I know what you're thinking. How could this even be possible? How could a sunset be the last one? And honestly, I wish I could tell you. The news stations all had long-winded segments that presented scientific data and intellectually challenging explanations of how the Earth's core had shifted, or how the rotation on its axis was about to cease. Honestly, I couldn't understand half the things they were saying. Each channel ended this segment with one final message, most of them mimicking each other. This evening, go outside and watch the sunset with your loved ones. This will be the last time you ever see it. This was such a romantic way to say something so bleak. To tell us to go and stand outside, watch this quick burning event that most of us had either ignored or seen 1,000 times, and appreciate that it was the last time it was going to happen. Of course, this led to some reasonable skepticism and a number of questions. If the half of the planet that we were on was forced into darkness, then surely the other half of the planet would be in never-ending daylight, right? That only made sense. Yet the professionals said that wasn't going to be the case. When they were asked how that was possible, how the sun would just cease to exist when it set for every part of the planet, they simply reiterated that this would be the last one, and that we should appreciate it. Then, of course, there were the people that were curious about how life would be sustainable without the sun. Without it, wouldn't we all be plunged into an ice age and killed off pretty much immediately? They struggled with this question, because the answer was technically yes. However, in this situation, they stated they weren't going to rely on technicalities, and that life would continue on as it had. This, of course, caused a major stir all around the planet. There was no way that life would continue without the sun, even excluding the fact that the planet would turn into a solid sphere of ice. Every plant that couldn't be put under a grow light would end up wilted and dying in a matter of days. Without the ability to grow mass crops, the population would end up starving. Once again, this notion was dismissed. They told us that no one would end up starving because of this. All of these situations that were a certainty without the sun were all being dismissed by the world's top scientists. How? How was this not to be the apocalyptic event that brought about the death of the planet? How could they say that no one would die from starvation, from freezing, from whatever other hardships would come from losing the sun? Of course, the confusion that stemmed from their official statement just ended up with people questioning the truth behind the statement. A number of conspiracy websites and videos went up on the internet. In the relatively short time we had this information, there were people everywhere that claimed that this was nothing more than a plan to make the populace subservient. that the world governments were going to somehow block out the sun for the rest of the world, and even some people that genuinely believed that there was some secret society that had cursed the planet, and this was our penance. Fortunately, or unfortunately, however you choose to look at it, we could easily prove the conspiracy theories either correct or incorrect. We were told the exact date that the final sunset would occur, the last second that we would see our glorious burning ball. And, much like predicted, the sunset took place at 8:29 p.m. on that Friday night. We sat on a blanket that we had placed on the flat section of our roof and watched the stars glow after the sun had finally finished setting. It was a cool night with a light breeze. The sounds of the city grew from silent anticipation to near explosive panic within a matter of minutes. Whether or not people believed that this was it, they had just witnessed, with their own eyes, the final solar event. So, what now? She looked over at me with a smile on her face. Well, now we just kind of sit here and wait to see what happens in the morning. Solar midnight is at about 1:22 in the morning. Sunrise should take place at around 6:30 or so. I guess we'll know by then what happens. I kept my eyes on the stars as I responded to her. And you're certain? Yeah, I'm certain. I nodded with a smile. We both just lay there silently, staring at the blackness of the night sky. The aforementioned panic of the city slowly died down as people went to bed and decided to sleep through the night as they waited to see what was going to happen. The hours passed and she fell asleep, but I couldn't bring myself to close my eyes. I wanted to be awake to see what actually took place. I wanted to know what was actually in store for our little planet. I would glance over at the small clock radio every once in a while to see how many hours passed by, but mostly I focused on the darkness of space and watched the gleaming stars as they danced across the sky. If anyone had been paying as much attention as I had at that moment, they would have noticed two things, which could have given them some interesting insight into the situation. The first thing was the stars were actually still dancing across the sky. Thus, the planet was, in fact, still rotating. The second thing to note was the absence of the moon. With no sun, it was basically just a dark rock floating around our planet. I watched the clock flip over to 6 in the morning, and then tuned into the sounds of the city. As the next half an hour passed, people would realize that the sun was not coming back, that last night's sunset was actually the last. With every minute that passed, the sounds of the city grew louder and louder. They were subtle sounds of people sobbing, screaming, panicking as the realization hit them. There was shouting, cars' engine roaring as people tried to speed out of the city with nowhere to go. Then came the sounds of gunshots, glass shattering, people destroying the city as a panicked mob. Everything came to its apex around 7 in the morning, when we were all sure that the statement of the scientists were right. You were right, hun, she said in between yawns and stretches. Yeah, I guess so, I sighed. I didn't really want to be. I know. She stared back up at the sky. So, what happens now? I'm not sure. I didn't want to tell her the truth. I didn't want her to know what exactly was going to happen. Hell, I wasn't even 100% certain about the next step. Just that there was going to be something. While everyone else was asking their questions and fighting with each other about whether or not we would all die of starvation or freezing, or whether the sun would even disappear at all, I was fully aware that it was going to happen. You see, around a month ago, my uncle died of an apparent suicide. He had shot himself in the basement with all his radio equipment. He was an avid collector of various radio equipments, a hobby he had actually passed on to me. After his funeral, I went over to his house and downstairs to the room where he kept all of his equipment. I sat at his desk and stared at his various sticky notes with random frequencies written on them. But one stuck out. It was on top of his strewn out detritus and had the word "End August 22nd" written on it and circled. Obviously, given the circumstances, I was curious about this. I turned on the equipment and put on the headphones, turning the dial to exactly what he had written. A single message played in the same tone that you would get if you called a disconnected telephone number. Notice 82220TE. This is a notice to all involved with Operation Terra and the surrounding solar system. Operation Terra has concluded, and the simulation will be going offline. The final solar event will be scheduled for the 235th day of the 2020th year. On the morning of day 236, we will commence the data purge. Thank you for your time and understanding. This notice repeated over and over again through the headphones. I listened to it a dozen times as I tried to understand what the hell I was actually hearing. From here, I obviously reported the information, and they studied the signal. From there, they formulated their statement and told the world about what was happening. Well, sort of. They told everyone about the final solar event. Sure, but they left out the final part of the note. I had to give them credit. They didn't lie. No one was going to freeze to death. No one was likely to starve. But no one knew that we were all going to be removed from existence. I was the only person in the general population that was aware of what was to come next, the data purge. At first, I was curious about what it was going to actually be, or what it would feel like, but the realization that if it was just data that was about to be purged, I would cease to exist. I assumed it would just be an instantaneous death, and we would all just stop being. As we stared up at the sky, and the clock clicked over to 8 a.m., something strange started to happen. The stars started to disappear, one by one, then the clouds, and finally the shades of blue in the sky. Within moments, it was pure black. Then the blackness began to feel like it was getting closer to us. I reached down and grabbed her hand as I watched our reality compress into itself. I could faintly hear the screaming, the hellish sound of agony through the city as the wind roared upward from the ground and towards the darkness that slowly descended. I kept my eyes open as I watched it engulf the taller buildings, and they became nothing. The closer it came, the stronger the suction into the darkness became. I let go of her as she was pulled into the void. I held my grip on anything I could grab hold of. I felt the darkness touch my skin. I felt my entire being as it was shredded into bits of data within whatever system was running the simulation, and felt agony as I was pulled into a string of ones and zeros and set to be overwritten. Can you hear that? I stared up at the ceiling as the light of the foggy night scratched its way into the side window. A few moments of silence passed before I got my answer. Hear what? She rolled over silently, an annoyed huff escaped her lungs before she continued her thoughts. I hear crickets outside the window. I think there's a frog out there, but I don't hear anything else. You can't hear? I paused and thought about what it was that was playing in my head. I don't know. It kind of sounds like talking. I focused on the sound a bit harder. Yeah, like people are talking. I can't make out the words, but it definitely sounds like a conversation. You're probably just hearing the TV next door, or something. She groggily pulled the blankets over her shoulders and turned away to ignore me. This is the third night in a row. You're going on about this. Please, just go to sleep, Wayne. Her dismissal didn't mean much to me at this point. After 7 years of marriage, distance is expected. Still, the fact that she couldn't hear what I was hearing was nothing less than disappointing. If she wanted me to shut up about it, I would shut up about it. Despite this, I wasn't planning on going to sleep. I was going to figure out what the hell was going on, where the sound was coming from. For a moment, I just lay there and stared at the cobwebs in the corner of the room. I counted the water spots in the ceiling from the time we had a hole in the roof. I traced imaginary lines in the popcorn bumps in the plaster that covered the surface above me. None of this was helpful. My brain was racing, and there was no way I was going to be able to ignore the conversations as it played out. The best way for me to describe what I was hearing, besides just saying it was someone talking, put in a pair of earphones. Set the volume on your phone to the absolute lowest setting you can. Then play some sort of sports commentary or something, but make sure it's in a different language. Basically, it felt like that. Like I was listening to a conversation in a different language at about the lowest volume possible. Despite what my wife said, this was not the third night with the voices. This was the second. The first night, it was simply a beeping or something like a tone. Then the second night, it turned into the voices. And while she may have wanted nothing to do with this situation, I had to agree it was a pain in the ass. I turned and sat up on the edge of the bed, glancing over at the clock. 1:46. It was 1:45 in the morning, and I was stuck sitting there, listening to something that only I could hear. Unable to sleep, I pushed myself up and walked away from the room towards the hallway into the bathroom. Shutting the door behind me, I stopped at the sink and ran the water. Then I splashed myself in the face a couple of times, staring at the drops as they fell into the sink. At that moment, it almost seemed like the voices stopped, like there was nothing more than silence pulsating in my ears. For that moment, it almost seemed like things were going to be okay. That moment was short-lived, though the voices were no longer what I heard. At that point, the sound of conversation was once more replaced with the sound of beeping, that weird rhythmic tone that would occur every second. Beep, beep, beep. This was actually more annoying than the talking. And what was worse is that it was actually louder this time. Almost like it was coming from the same room, or a room adjacent. I walked around the small bathroom with my ear to the wall, and for 3 or 4 walls, there was nothing. No indication that the tone was in any of those directions. However, when I stopped into the shower, the tone was louder. Part of me was certain that whatever was making that sound had to be on the other side of that wall. I thought about the layout of my own house for a moment and became even more confused. As far as I could tell, that wall was directly against the walk-in closet in my bedroom. If it were in there, the sound should have been louder when I was in the bedroom. I shook off my confusion and walked back towards my bedroom, around the bed and into the walk-in closet. It was cramped and full of clothing and various other stowaway items. But that sound didn't seem any louder when I entered. I started to pull the boxes away from the wall. I threw clothing onto the floor of the bedroom until the room was pretty much empty. The tone continued, but it hadn't increased. I once more pressed my ear against the wall that was on the other side of the shower, and at that moment, it seemed that the tone had gotten a bit louder. This sound This constant beeping, this constant droning that was sure to drive me insane, was somehow on both sides of this one wall simultaneously. I pulled back and stared at the painted drywall, that shade of eggshell white that every modern home seemed to be painted, and thought about the situation. There was no way that the sound was coming from either side of the wall. It had been across both rooms, which means it was likely coming from inside the wall. Whatever the hell it was that was keeping me awake, whatever it was that was producing these sounds, had to be inside the wall. The matter of how was the question that I assumed I could answer later, but I had to find whatever this thing was. I turned back into the pile of items on the floor and grabbed a screwdriver, readying myself to tear into the wall, only to pause for a moment as I heard my wife snore. It would have been impolite for me to start in on the wall right next to her, so I took myself back to the bathroom, back into the bathtub, and back to the plastic lining on the wall. It was difficult, I will admit. At first, I couldn't seem to pierce into the plastic with a simple flathead screwdriver. Then it occurred to me that this was likely just a protective covering over the drywall, and all I had to do was find the edge. I scraped along the corner until I was able to pry a small space between the two layers, and I just pulled it away. The vinyl cover ripped away from the bare drywall, pulling chunks of paper along with it. After a few minutes and a few cuts on my hand, I was able to completely remove it. I then started into the sheetrock, prying away chunks of gypsum and successfully destroying the wall of my bathroom. From an outside perspective, I probably looked crazy, but I knew I was making progress. The tunes sounded just slightly louder. I stabbed the wall over and over, breaking it more and more, until there was a sizable hole, leaving only exposed insulation and pieces of drywall from the closet. The wall between the two rooms was rather thin, but I was certain the sound was coming from there. I paused, listening closely, and waiting for the next hint of where it was coming from. I could hear it, the tone, and it was certainly coming from inside the wall. I glanced around. I was exposed, until my eye landed on an electrical wire that seemed to go further into the wall. Why on earth would there be wiring in the wall, behind the shower? It had to be the power line to whatever device was in there. I took my screwdriver, and I kept prying away at small pieces of the drywall, tracing the wire all the way around the corner, and to the door frame, where it went up and over, and into the hallway. I tirelessly tore holes into the wall, tracking this cable that I knew had to go where I needed it to. A few times I thought I lost track of the line, but I just made a bigger hole in the wall to make sure I knew exactly where it was going. It ran through insulation. I ripped it out. It ran through the studs. I used the screwdriver enough to crack them and to pull the line. It ran behind the tile of the kitchen, and you can be damn sure that little cement wasn't going to stop me. I admit, I was left a bit of a mess when I was done, and what's worse is that my adventure led me nowhere. The wire I was tracing led to the garage, which then ended up at the circuit box, and out in the garage. The sound seemed quieter. In my moment of desperation, I had a brilliant idea. If this device, this annoyance, was running our electricity, then I could flip the breaker and it would go away. I reached up to the main breaker and shoved it to the off position. As soon as I heard the click, the sound stopped. There was no more tone, no beeping, no voices. There was nothing. I could feel myself grinning at the electrical box as the pride of solving this problem washed over me. I felt it was time to go to bed and get some sleep. I'd earned it. I walked back into the house from the garage and glanced around the room, only to be met with my wife staring at me from the hallway. She stared at me with her mouth wide open, her eyes shifting to the various holes in the wall, the damaged tiles, the detritus that was left scattered around our home. I held my smile. Yeah, there was a bit of a mess, but I could deal with it in the morning. "What the hell did you do, Wayne?" She screeched at me. I stepped into the living room and reached out to her, embracing her in a tight hug. She did not reciprocate. I solved the problem. The sound is... I paused as I held her in the hug. From the silence of the room rose a familiar sound, that horrifying sound of conversation in a different language, muffled and unintelligible. Wait, can you hear that? You destroyed our home. I disregarded her claims and shushed her, pulling her away to listen to the room. As I did, it seemed to grow more faint. For a moment, I struggled to hear it, but it quickly clicked. I leaned back in towards my wife's face, and the sounds of speaking grew slightly. I pulled away again, and the volume decreased. I knew what this meant. I knew what I had to do. I think I get why you can't hear it, honey. I smiled at her slightly, as my fingers tightly gripped a flathead screwdriver. But we're going to fix that. Don't worry. This damn thing is really starting to get on my nerves. I angrily smacked the side of the machine a couple times. I knew it wouldn't fix it, but it was therapeutic to get my aggression out. I've been working in this office for 7 years of my life. I spent half of my 20s and part of my 30s working in this office, completing menial tasks and listening to the drone of the lights overhead. Been to hundreds, probably thousands of pointless meetings, and taking on more tasks than I could honestly ever fathom. All of this, the joys, the hardship, the good and the bad times, were formed into an explosive ball of rage every single time I had to use this damned copy machine. Paper jam and rear loader. I stared at the small cracked screen on the front. This isn't a rear loader. You only have a front loader. Why are you lying to me? I smacked the side again, while taking my aggression out on the machine with satisfaction. It wasn't going to solve my problems. I took a deep breath and paused. I needed these copies several hours ago, so I would have had time to get these bound for the board meeting the next day. At this point, I was already working half an hour over when I should have left, so there was no point in getting aggressive and trying to rush through things. I was going to be there for a few hours extra anyways. After troubleshooting the machine for another half an hour, I finally achieved what I needed. I went back to my desk and put together the presentation binders for the meeting. After finishing the last one, I glanced over to the clock on the wall, 8:40 p.m. I managed to burn away my entire night working on these pointless collections of paper. I grabbed my phone to see if my wife was angry with me for not coming home. That was when I noticed a text from John, my boss. We have an extra presentation partner at the meeting tomorrow. Make sure to have an extra binder. I stared at this text message. I could feel my blood pressure doubling. I spent the last 3 hours plus making these presentations, only to be one short. My eyes shifted to the copy machine, and I could feel the dread as it flooded through my veins. There was a moment where I wanted to send a text back to John, telling him to shove this binder so far into a specific orifice that he could determine the chemical makeup of the copier ink. But in that moment, I decided that paying my mortgage was more important than that single moment of euphoria. I pulled the binding from one of the already finished books and walked over to the machine, slamming the paper into the copy tray and staring down at the glowing LCD screen. I pressed a button to start the copy. The belts whirred and the tray lifted. Everything looked like it was going to work. And for a moment, I was almost feeling relieved that the machine and I had finally come to an understanding and respect each other. I say almost, because as soon as everything looked like it was going to work, the copier beeped and the screen shifted to a disgusting pure white screen with the small black text and the red exclamation point. I stared down to see what message was going to cause my aneurysm. Paper jam and rear loader. Once again, these words tore through my soul. The only benefit was that this time, I knew what to do. I pulled the front tray out and leaned down, staring into the paper mechanism. To my surprise, there wasn't a ball of paper crammed into the metal this time. My confusion and anger was more than palpable at this point. What the hell was wrong this time then? I replaced the drawer and started to stare at the various notes and symbols all over the machine. It was then I noticed that there was a small note that was sitting underneath the machine. I grabbed it and realized that it was my saving grace. Rear loader is actually top loader, lift top if jammed. The fact that I found this note at that moment was nothing shy of a sign from the gods of office work. I wanted to ask which god it was, but honestly, I didn't really care. I'd have been thankful if it were Loki playing a prank on me, or even Cthulhu sending me down the trail of madness. I lifted the top half of the machine, and, as if fate was finally going to make my life go my way, there was a half a sheet of paper that was crinkled into the slot. I reached in and tried to pull the paper out. The sheet tore in half, leaving some of it within the machine. Oh, no you don't, you bastard! I reached in further and gripped the paper as tight as I could. As I grabbed it and started to pull, I heard a clicking sound and the belt started to move. I looked over in confusion as the motor kicked on, not thinking about the fact that I was still holding onto the paper and my hand was still deep within the machine. The mechanism started to pull the paper that I was holding onto, and before I could let go, I felt the paper slide across my hand, cutting it. I pulled back in pain and stared at the paper as it was shoved through the machine and out the top. A small spot of blood sitting on the page. I glanced down at the cut that ran across my hand. It was a small, thin line that was pulling blood in my palm. I shifted my attention to the inside of the machine and noticed a small red dot that now littered the internal component of the copier. After a second, I simply sighed and shut the top and moved on. I checked the screen to see if it was still throwing an error. To my surprise, it looked like it was clear. I pressed to continue and turned to walk away for a moment to get a tissue from my hand, but something was off. Normally, the copier was a noisy, clunky piece of trash, but it was louder than normal. The motor was going crazy, and there was a lot of mechanical noise coming from it. I kept staring at it, half expecting it to tell me that there was another jam or something, but it didn't. It just kept speeding up and getting louder and louder. I just stood there, staring at the outdated machine and waiting for it to explode, impaling me with a gear and proclaiming that it had finally gotten its revenge on me for years of abuse. Just when I thought it was genuinely about to blow, the power started to flicker in the building. The lights blinked off and on and dimmed repeatedly until everything shut off. I stood there in the darkness, staring in the direction of the copier, and listened as the mechanism slowed to a stop. Honestly, that damn thing sounded like the motor was seizing. It made a clicking noise, like something snapped inside. When it finally came to a full stop, the lights slowly faded back on, dimly illuminating the floor. The screen started glowing again as the power came on. It ran through the normal motions of booting up, showing the logo, saying, "Please wait," for several moments, and then it went back to the main screen. I pressed the copy button again, tried to get it going again, but it immediately locked up and went back to the error screen. Error CL1. Once again, this device was trying my patience. I looked around for any other sticky notes with information, anything that indicated what the hell CL1 meant. But it looked like this was a new one. One of the thousands of codes that this frustrating machine had given us since we purchased it. This is why I need an assistant. Someone to do all these bullshit tasks for me. Someone to design these presentations, make me copies, get me coffee. Someone with a willingness to kill for their minimum wage job. I chuckled as I rubbed the sweat from my forehead, a side effect of my escalating heart rate. Basically, I need someone like how I was back in my early 20s. Someone stupid enough to do everyone else's work, while not showing that they're dying inside. I let out a heavy, defeated sigh. Me, before corporate life beat me into a pathetic pulp. It was at this point that I'd just given up. There was no way I was going to try and get that damn thing to work again, and it was already past 9. I conceded, going back to my desk and grabbing my backpack. Worst case scenario, I'd come back in the morning and try again. Best case, I'd give John the 14 copies I had, and someone wouldn't show up, so we'd have an extra. I honestly didn't sleep much that night. Something about the whole situation was causing me to be mentally obsessed over it. For some reason, I was dwelling so hard on the fact that I was going to be blamed for breaking the copier, or that my boss was going to be aggressively angry with me not doing what he asked. Normally these thoughts mean nothing to me, but something was different about that night. Something was giving me this strange feeling like I had genuinely made a mistake. Dwelling on it did nothing for me. So I stared at the back of my eyelids for a while, at least until my alarm started going off and I got up to get ready for work. I went through the motions, groggily, drove to the office, and sat in my car, preparing myself for the inevitable conversation John was going to want to have with me. After I had fought with myself for several minutes on the issue, I decided it was better to just go in and face it than drag it out any longer. I got out, entered the building, and got into the elevator to get up to the 5th floor. The door shut, and it stopped one floor up. As they opened again, John stepped forward to give me a friendly grin. "Hey, there's the man of the hour." He patted me on the shoulder and stood beside me. "Thank you for staying late and getting those presentation binders done. They came out looking absolutely gorgeous. Good call on the color palette." "Oh, thanks?" I was a bit confused at this statement. "It was no big deal. I'm just sorry I didn't get the extra one done. You can just give the guest mine. I don't really need..." "You made enough. There were 16 on my desk this morning." He glanced over at me with a confused look. My face must have looked the same as his. Not only had I been one short, I never put them on his desk. They were still on mine when I'd left. The only thing that I could think of was that someone else had gotten in early and taken care of it for me. Anyways, great job. He patted me on the shoulder and exited the elevator, walking straight towards the boardroom. I stared out at the floor as the door shut, trying to think as hard as I could who in that building gave enough of a damn about me to actually help me out. Couldn't come up with a single name. I exited on my floor and started towards my desk. "Hey Chris, good morning." I waved at the receptionist as I passed. Yeah, good morning again?" She responded with a squeaky tone. "Oh, hey, the maintenance company called back, and they said they could send out someone if we needed them to. They said they have never heard of an error CL1, so it'd probably require a technician." "Okay," I paused, glancing back towards her. "Why are you telling me this, though? Shouldn't you tell someone in the office management?" "You're the one that reported it, and you're the one that called them." Chris didn't even look up from the screen as she responded. "Seems like you took responsibility, so I'm telling you." "Oh." I looked back towards the area where I sat. "Well, thank you." She had to be mistaking me for someone else on my team. I decided that it was just best to take the knowledge and report it to whoever else was in that morning. Arguing with her would get me nowhere. I walked past the empty cubicles, looking for anyone else that may have reported the copier error. To my surprise, there was no one else around. I checked all the desks on the way to mine, the open office. It looked like I was the first person to get in on my team. I shrugged it off. It really wasn't my problem. I rounded the corner and got closer to my desk, only to see my lamp on. At first, I thought maybe that I had left it on overnight, but then I noticed the sounds of someone typing and the glow of my monitor appearing beyond the cubicle walls. At first, I was angry. Why the hell was someone at my desk and using my computer? I thought about throwing my case on my desk aggressively and asking who they thought they were. Thought about calling security and having them reprimanded regardless of who it was. But then I saw who it was. I started from around 5 feet behind the cubicle, and I saw this man was sitting in my chair and working on my computer. I was standing there, watching myself work at my desk. I had to be hallucinating, because if I wasn't, then I apparently had a long-lost twin that had taken over my job. I slowly approached the desk, just to make absolutely sure, and with every step, I became more certain that the man in the chair was me. His hair, his glasses, the mole on his neck, every single detail was mine. How did this happen? Why did this happen? Most importantly, what was happening? Excuse me? I reached out and put my hand on his shoulder. As my hand hit him, his hand stopped moving on the keyboard. He just sat there, staring at the monitor without turning to face me. Hello? I wanted to ask who you were. After standing and waiting for several minutes, I gave his shoulder a slight pull and turned him around to face me. His eyes were cold and expressionless. His face was blank and pale. There was no mistaking who this was. It was me. This man looked to be the perfect copy of me in every way, except what made me human. He looked like he was dead inside, completely void of thought and feeling. Can you hear me at all? I waved my hand in front of his face. He continued to stare at the carpet. Oh my God, I need more coffee. As I made the statement, the man sitting in the chair, the copy of me, glanced up and nodded, then stood up and walked away from my desk. I watched as he walked towards the break room and out of sight, almost as if he was a mindless drone with only enough willpower to complete the task at hand. Just as he passed the corner and exited my line of sight, I noticed a second one exit the copy room. He looked exactly the same as the other copy. His face a blank canvas, but every single minute detail the same as mine. He walked out onto the main floor, paused, then walked over to my desk, sat in my chair, and started doing seamlessly random tasks on my computer. I watched as he opened email and responded to them in a professional manner that was consistent with how I did. After finishing those, he moved on to selecting dates and times for meetings that needed to occur across teams. He pulled and unpacked various spreadsheets, and he even called one of our offices to ask questions about their compliance with our policy. Somehow, this copy was doing my job better and more efficiently than I had ever done it. As I was standing there, my eyes fixed on how beautiful the specimen in front of me was performing, my awe was interrupted by the original copy returning. He approached and reached out to hand me a large cup from a local coffee shop. He stared at me for a moment, almost as if he was expecting something. It took me a moment, but I realized he was waiting for my approval on the coffee. Oh, my apologies. I took a sip of the searing hot liquid. Peppermint mocha, my favorite. That's perfect. Thank you, sir. I smiled at him and looked back at the other copy. Somehow, life had decided to give me not one, but two assistants that looked enacted just like me, minus a few emotional details. That could do my job, that could run my errands, and I could sit at home playing video games while raking in the money. Who in their right minds wouldn't want to have someone do all the boring crap they had to do every day? Well, patted the first copy on the shoulder. I guess I should let you get back to work. I smiled again at him. He nodded in confirmation. I grabbed my case and strapped it over my shoulder, while walking away with a satisfied grin on my face. As I took a couple steps, I paused. A strange sound filled the silence of the room. It's almost like someone was struggling to breathe. I turned around to the copies, only to see something I would have never anticipated. I watched in absolute horror as the first copy repeatedly stabbed the second copy in the throat with a pair of scissors. My pair of scissors. He pulled them out and thrust them back in as hard as he could several times, before deciding to place them neatly back in my pencil holder. I then watched as he grabbed the now lifeless corpse and pulled him out of the seat, tossing him effortlessly onto the floor, and then sitting down to resume his work. His shirt was drenched in blood, his hands were also lined in red, and it was collecting on everything in the cubicles as he went back to work. My keyboard, my phone, my pens, and various sheets of paper were all now stained red. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest and the color drained from my face. I had literally just witnessed me killing another version of myself. This was the point when I had decided that I needed to get out of there. I needed to leave and get as far away from whatever this was as I possibly could. I quickly turned away to leave and smacked face first into someone else. I instinctively apologized till I glanced up and noticed the person was another copy of me. He stared at me, his blank eyes and his face expressionless. Oh my God, no, not more! I stepped back as I watched him. He kept his eyes on me as I nearly trembled in horror. What now? Are you going to kill the other copy? Are you going to kill everyone else and do their jobs too? He stared at me for a moment before nodding and stepping past me towards one of the offices. I watched as he entered and winced as I heard the sound of someone greeting him, then screeching as they were, I assume, murdered. The hard smack against the ground told me that my assumption was correct. It took this long until this situation, to this exact moment, for me to realize that if someone else walked onto the floor, they were likely to be murdered by these copies. Not to mention, if any investigation was to take place, I was going to be charged with the murder. These clones were all exact copies of myself. If they investigated the murders, they'd find my DNA, my fingerprints, everything that pointed to me as the murderer. The idea of running away from this place re-entered my mind. I disregarded the scene behind me and started running towards the elevator, only pausing as I noticed a copy of myself sitting at the front desk. Oh, no. I approached the counter and smacked the surface. What the hell did you do with Chris? The copy glanced up at me, then slowly looked down onto the floor beside him. I followed where he was looking, only to see Chris's body, her neck completely twisted around. I immediately struggled to stop myself from vomiting as I turned back to my original mission, getting the hell out of there. I swiftly stepped onto the elevator and started jamming the button. After a moment, the doors pulled open. I was grieved at the sight of my boss's mangled body lying on the floor, and 3 more copies standing and staring at me with emotionless eyes. I turned to run to the stairs. There were 5 more of them in the main area, sweeping, mopping, cleaning the windows, all of them doing the menial tasks that they had decided they needed to do. The room started to spin as I tried to look in every direction for a way out of this mess. There was only one way to get through this that I could think of: getting rid of the evidence. If there was no proof that a murder took place in the building, then I could possibly get out of this unscathed. Well, at least physically. Mentally, I was going to be scarred forever. Hey, all of you! I shouted, hoping they would listen to me. It seemed to work, as they all paused their work and turned to me, staring with those glazed over eyes. I need you to... There's something unsettling about seeing dozens of copies of myself standing and staring at me, waiting for my instructions. I need you to get rid of all these bodies. I need you to make sure there isn't a single body in this building when you're done. I watched as they all stood still, processing what I had requested of them for a few seconds. They all turned to look at each other and simultaneously nodded. At first, I thought my plan would be successful. I started to let my guard down as the copies moved towards the corpse of my boss. They lifted him out of the elevator and moved him over to the break room, placing him on one of the tables, placing him gently on the surface, then pausing to all stare at each other. Suddenly, the feeling of the room changed as the group of them all leaned down and started biting into his flesh. They all took chunks of his skin off with each bite, slowly pulling bits of his body off and chewing it up with emotionless stares. Couldn't hold it anymore. I leaned over and vomited my breakfast onto the smooth tiles, feeling lightheaded and dizzy as I stumbled back towards the wall. I shifted my stare from the bloody scene in front of me to the main floor. There were more of them than I could count. They were all leaned over dead bodies, ripping into the flesh and ingesting them. I slowly stepped away from the situation, every single step taking in the absolute horror in front of me. This whole morning had gone from a fairly confusing situation to a horrific, gruesome group of cannibal clones consuming my coworkers. "Excuse me?" A shallow, raspy whisper hit my ear from over my shoulder. I turned to face another copy as he stared down at me. I stared at him in terror, shaking and breathing rapidly. "What?" I choked as I spoke. "What do you want?" "Get rid of," he whispered again, struggling to speak. "All bodies. Not a single body left." His words, my words from earlier, were a terrifying explanation of what I had requested. I was going to be next. They were going to remove me as well. I shook my head and stepped back. No, no, I won't let you kill me, I shouted at him. He continued approaching me with every backward step I took. Leave me alone!
Remove.
He growled once more, his hands reaching out towards me. I had to think fast. I threw my coffee in his face and jumped into a sprint towards the end of the floor. There was only one other escape, the fire exit. I ran as quickly as I could, past the same disgusting scene in every direction. Clone after clone eating corpse after corpse. I dodged as many as I could, and I made a rush towards the emergency door. I grabbed the handle, twisted it, and pulled it as hard as I could, only to be met with another damn clone, standing right in my way and giving me that same murderous stare as the other. I looked around once more for any method of escape, my eyes finally landing on the door to the copy room. I ran as fast as I could, dodging as many of them as I could, shoving the door closed and locking it. As soon as I locked it, I could hear them all on the other side smacking it, trying to get in. They were merciless in their pursuit. The only thing I could think to do at this point was to wait it out and hope they would eventually give up. I pushed my back against the door and slowly fell to the floor, sitting and staring at the small empty room. I shut my eyes and slowly tried to catch my breath, trying to reflect on what was going on. They were doing what I told them to do, so they were just going to get rid of the bodies and then move on, right? As long as they didn't see me, maybe they would think that the floor was empty and leave. Or at least go back to being distracted by their work. Until then, all I could do was wait and be as quiet as I could. My thoughts, as well as my silence, were interrupted by the sudden and sharp sound of the copier starting up. The small motor started making a whirring noise, and the mechanism started to move. At first, I thought nothing of it. It was an old hunk of junk, and it would make random noises every now and then. But then, the motor started to go faster and faster. Exactly as it had the night before, it sped up, making louder noises with every passing second. The lights overhead dimmed slightly, as if the building was losing power, but they lit back up to full capacity after only a few moments. The small LCD screen lit up with the error screen. The machine beeped. Error CL1. I read it. It was the same mysterious error as before. Well, looks like maintenance won't be coming to fix that anytime soon. I chuckled. At least I could find something to laugh at in this new scenario of corporate hell. My small joy was cut even shorter than anticipated as I watched the copier start to spew out a strange pink slime. It pulled on the floor by the machine, a viscous, flesh-toned liquid that was slowly starting to collect and build into a pile. I watched as it quickly started to take form, the form of a human head. My head! The flesh mouth opened, its eyes stared at me as it continued to be created by the fluid pouring from the machine. My heart started to race as I searched the room for anything to protect myself with, only to find nothing short of paper and a tone cartridge. There was no way I was going to survive. The copy machine, the old hunk of plastic that had caused me many migraines, was literally creating clones of myself in a few minutes flat. Whatever eldritch horror had decided to enter this office building had determined that the copy machine would be its entrance into this world, and I would be the one to let it out. I took a few deep breaths as I prepared to defend myself against the clones. Hell-bent on murdering me and getting rid of my body, I focused as the gelatinous blob took full form and stood up, turning its gaze right at me. The room was heavy and silent, all except for the beeping of the machine as the screen continued to read, Error CL1.